Welcome to the first of 4 virtual forums on the Adult and Continuing Education International Compendium. The Compendium is innovative in its design and construction, written by an international group of authors. Each volume has an introduction to the volume, table of contents for the complete compendium in an appendix, and a glossary. Each short article contains concepts, examples, implications, keywords, and in the ebook version, the cross-references are hyperlinked to other relevant articles in the compendium. This forum focuses on volume 3 of the compendium. The volume is comprised of 22 articles organized into 5 sections, which address topics and subtopics important to the effective development of leadership and administrative practices. Salient leadership and administration concepts, ideas, and theories in the volume include administration and coordination, leadership and vision, organizational change and culture, planning and resource allocation, and stakeholders and structures. Consequently, these articles can be part of a module or unit in a formal course or serve as resources for practitioners who work with adults. We are grateful that Professor Ronald Cervero will provide a presentation today on Article 58, entitled Continuing Professional Education, History and Influences. He co-authored the article with Professor Barbara Daly. While you may know Professor Cervero's work on program planning and the importance of determining who should be at the planning table, he is also a well-known international expert on continuing professional education. He is professor and associate director for remote campus education in the graduate programs of health professions education at the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences in Bethesda, Maryland. Pretty large title to run. Before we get started, Professor Anita Samuel will provide some, I guess, guidelines for how you can participate in this session. And then we will hear from Professor Cervero. So Anita, take it away.
Okay, hi everyone. So for today's session, you have been given access to both the microphone and the video. Using the video is completely optional, but we do request that you all turn off your microphones when you're not using it. This is going to be a very interactive session where you're going to be asking questions. You can ask questions in 2 ways. You can write in the chat area, or you can also raise your hand, and then Ron can call on each of you, take turns and call each of you, and then you can ask your question. So that's completely optional as well. If you haven't yet seen the raise hand feature, if you open up the option for participants at the bottom of the screen, you will see a list of participants. Scroll right down to the end of the list of participants, and there will be a little button that says raise hand. You can go ahead and click that, and you will see a little palm that raises up. So that's one option, or just type in the chat area, and I will be monitoring all those questions just to make sure that we get everything. Okay, so I'm going to hand it off now.
Okay. Thanks, Larry. Thanks, Anita. Thanks to AAACE for hosting the session. I'm delighted to be with you today. I think this compendium is a great opportunity for collaboration in the field of adult and continuing ed, so I'm glad to be part of it. My goal today really is to try to foster dialogue and answer questions and get into a discussion with you. Barb Daly sends her regrets. She had a commitment on this day, but she's been instrumental in the development of the chapter. Barb and I have worked over the last 8 years on a number of writing projects on continuing professional education. So I think this chapter today and the discussion really reflects some of her thinking too. We did a practice run yesterday with the technology, and one of the things that Larry Martin said, this is a very short chapter. It's only about 1,000 words. So he said there's probably a lot of stuff on the cutting room floor. So I thought we'd do some rooting around on the floor to get us started. I'd like to give some personal context to how we got to this contribution in 2018. And really, I want to just put out there two major points to kind of get us started on the conversation that give a little bit of context and background for the chapter and for CPE in general. From the personal side of things, I took my first position in continuing medical education, which of course is part of the larger field of CPE, with the Illinois State Medical Society, involved with their CME accreditation program. So that's how I got my feet wet in this. And then over the last 3 decades, I've spent a lot of time working in the health professions. Mostly, that's been my primary area of emphasis, but I've also done quite a bit of work in the legal field with judges and lawyers, with social workers, spent quite a bit of time with clergy on their continuing ed, and then being in a college of ed, you can't really avoid the whole teaching profession and leadership development, which is so central to most of our work in colleges of education. And as Larry said, right now in 2016, I left the University of Georgia for this fantastic opportunity at Uniformed Services University to help develop a graduate program in health professions education. So our students are clinicians, primarily clinicians, physicians and nurses, et cetera, throughout the military health system. And it's just a great opportunity to be here and build out this program. So let me just now turn to a couple major points that maybe implicit in this chapter that have a lot to do with how we got here today in 2018. And I have to add that I have a lot of debt for the kind of intellectual contribution here in CPE to both Alan Knox, who was the consulting editor on my first book on effective continuing ed in the professions in 1988, and especially to Cy Houle, who was really my first professor in adult education at the University of Chicago, and who wrote the really seminal work in CPE called Continuing Learning in the Professions in 1980. So the big idea here is that, the professions were percolating along for the better part of the 20th century, building their infrastructure in the pre-licensure field. So if you could just so we have a point of reference, talk about medical school, because everyone's familiar with that, but you can think about other pre-licensure programs. They spent a vast number of amount of resources, both intellectual, practical, financial, to build up the profession of medicine and nursing and law and social work and veterinarians and so on and so forth. So this is what's considered the first phase of professional education, followed by the second phase, which we think about as kind of the residency phase, really where professionals are molded and become in practice for the first time. So those two phases took up a great deal of thought, but the largest phase of professional development is after that residency induction phase, where we're in practice for 30 and 40 years. And at that point, up until the 60s, the idea was, you're kind of on your own. You go to do some updates, Maybe you learn a little bit from your friends and colleagues in practice, but there was not this kind of systematic thought and organizational infrastructure built up. And so in the 60s, 1960s, this notion that, we really need to think seriously and help the professionals through that long phase of their career through continuing education. So this long arc of history, where we're finally starting to take account of these things. So you saw, for example, the first law for mandatory continuing education was passed in 1972 in New Mexico for physicians. And from there on in, you saw the policymakers and the leaders of the professions get serious about helping professionals kind of fulfill their contract to society and to their patients and clients and so on. So the idea is that that really Cy Hool, I think, broached this to the first time in his book in 1980, is that we're going to build systems of continuing professional development that that really are as important and rival the first two phases of professional development. And so it's, of course, a lot more complicated during this 30 years of practice because you have multiple providers, such as, not just universities, but of course, workplaces, which is the major provider of CPE. You have professional associations, you have independent providers out there. So it's very complicated to think about a system. There are competing agendas. There's educational agendas as well as economic and political agendas. There's a great deal of interest on how do you use education and learning to impact practice. And most recently, the whole concept of interprofessional education has really taken root. So there's a lot going on as we think about building out systems of continuing education, or I think the more appropriate term is continuing professional development. So that's one big idea, that each profession was building considering building systems of continuing professional development. And as I look back over to the 1980 book that Cy wrote, a lot of what he talked about there, we're living out, 38 years later. So I think there's been a lot of developments, and we can talk about some of what you see out there and how you're kind of doing this in your own practice. So that's one idea. The second idea is when Cy and Alan and others were seeing this as professors of adult education, that, each profession is doing this on their own. But really, from a perspective of adult education, there's so many common concerns and issues. I mean, basically, you're planning education, even though you're not a subject matter expert, you're planning education and teaching and doing faculty development. A lot of those processes are the same, whether you're dealing with physicians or social workers or teachers or educational leaders or engineers or whatever. So, this notion that we should think about a field of continuing professional education that binds together the educational practice across the professions was first, I think Cy Hool probably and Alan broached this in the 70s, and that's kind of the precursor, like 40 years later for this chapter. There's a lot of common issues around how to deliver effective CE, quality assurance, and so you see a lot of these issues coming to the fore in continuing professional education. So we teach graduate courses in continuing professional education. And I know I started teaching one in 1980. I know some of you also teach courses in this. So that's some of how we got into this business of CPE in the field of adult education. So those are the two big ideas I wanted to elaborate on that maybe weren't quite as explicit in the chapter. So why don't I stop there and see what kinds of questions we have, and let's get into a conversation about what you'd like to talk about.
Someone's video is going in and out. Occasionally, I think someone needs to mute.
So don't be shy, post a question, raise your hand with the raise hand icon.
Where do you think PD is going, and perhaps comment on digital badging?
Right, so Leslie's question, can everyone see these questions, I assume? Yeah, anyway, so Leslie asked, where do you think PD is going, and perhaps comment on digital badging? So, you know, I think, you know, I think the major push, and we're, you know, it's certainly we're seeing this in the health professions, is the integration of professional development and quality improvement. In other words, these systems that for many years were separate, which was, you know, let's teach health professionals kind of give them updates on knowledge and skills and so on. What we've been seeing and where the major pushes in the health professions is basically to use kind of quality improvement processes, like what's going on with quality of care in the hospital setting, and using that as a kind of form of needs assessment to then build out programs of professional development for the learners in that hospital or in the medical center or wherever. So I think this notion, if professional development is going to be considered important in the C-suite and in the, you know, at executive levels, we need to show that it's having an impact. It's not just an individual activity, but it's a collective activity that has an impact on say, the quality of care if you're in a hospital, on student achievement as if you're in a school, you know, and so on. So I think that's where I see across the professions is this integration of professional development and practice. You know, I've been reading a lot about digital badging. I think, you know, the whole notion that universities kind of control the certification of professionals, you know, that's been breaking down for some time. And so I see the digital badging that's done possibly or usually by outside providers other than universities as just a consequence of that kind of breakdown on the whole certification process that goes on in the, you know, in a realm of practice. So you know, I think it was probably inevitable. I think there are powerful forces supporting this. I don't know what it's going to look like, who's going to own it, how it's going to be monetized, and those kind of things. But I do think that I just see that as something that's going to keep moving forward.
Okay, so Shelley has a question. How do you think that CPAE and AAACE can continue to engage with this training and keep making people?
Well, you know, from the Commission of Professors of Adult Education, I mean, I think the major thing we can do is, you know, is to, you know, we can certainly teach courses in this area on continuing professional education. We can conduct research, but we can also engage and create partnerships with other, as professors in adult education, create partnerships with other professional schools in the university. I mean, we are highly qualified and experts in terms of a lot of the issues that you know, a school of social work or a school of veterinary medicine or a school of business about teaching and learning. And I think that that I know, I'm sure many of you have done this, but I've done a lot of this over the years, not just at other places, that they say, oh my God, you know, there's actually a theory and there's an evidence base around how to do teaching and learning. So I think that it's this engagement with and partnership with certainly other parts of the university, but certainly other workplaces that would value this expertise. So I think kind of owning that level of expertise and forming those partnerships.
I think the next question is from Carol.
Can you talk a bit about individualized professional development? I was a high school teacher for 30 years and found a lot of time PD I was required to attend and not relate to my own experience. Yeah, well, I think, you know, that's a common refrain, Carol, you know, that the individuals responsible for the professional development program in our language really haven't done an effective needs assessment. You know, they'll deliver, if you were a teacher, they will have delivered kind of packaged curriculum that you were intended to use, or they'd bring someone in from the outside who doesn't really know anything about your context to teach. So I think this goes back to my comment earlier about where PD is going, is to integrate, you know, in the school context, like you were a high school teacher, to integrate the ongoing work of you as teachers, as the teachers in this school, what their needs are to improve the student achievement. So I think that's really the way to make it relevant and personal and relevant to your experience. So, you know, I see that as, that's a kind of a driver in that regard.
Lee had a question. Lee Bunnett, he has a question.
How can universities function as certifying bodies to create a broader recognition of CPE training? You know, I think that can schools function as providers or clearinghouses? I mean, I really think that, and I've talked about this quite a bit over the years, that we, by giving in adult education, by offering degrees, by producing graduates with MEDs and EDDs and PhDs in CPE, in effect, we are certifying that's the credential that our students who become graduates use on the labor market. And so, you know, I see a lot of this when I go out and talk and consult and meet with colleagues. Adult learning, CPE generally, is recognized as an area that, you know, where you can make a contribution to the professions that you're working with. So I think it's really, we are already doing this and have been for years, providing this kind of recognition through our degrees.
J.S. Olson had a question.
I'm revamping CPE class for delivery in the fall. What are the key current and emerging ideas that are most important for my students to grapple with? Well, that's a great question. Maureen Cody has just done a source book on continuing professional education that Barb and I had a chapter, and I would certainly recommend you take a look at that. There's a lot of good chapters in there. And, you know, I think the emerging ideas, you know, I mentioned one already, which is the integration of continuing education and continuing professional development with practice. That is absolutely central. So
go ahead.
So that's one. I think the whole notion of the use of new forms of media and has really opened up vast areas for learning that, you know, we just didn't have 30 years ago or 40 years ago. So I think I would say technology enabled approaches to learning would be another area of great consequence. A third area that is has gained a great deal of prominence is interprofessional education, not just in the health professions, but if you think about a school context where you have nurses and teachers and leaders and all sorts of other professions engaged in helping our students to achieve success. So I think the whole interprofessional education, collaborative practice is another big area. But I would certainly ask you to take a look at Maureen's book, because she's done a great job kind of laying some of these issues out.
Got another question from Lee Barnett.
Is there a benefit working it backwards, offering generous credit for completion of CPE toward academic degrees? Offering credit for completion of CPE. Do you mean, I'm not sure if you mean, are you talking about professionals, the learners themselves? I'm just not sure what exactly you are intending with that question.
Lee can
he jump in?
Yeah, you can ask him to just jump in. Lee, would you just
prior
like to...
learning. Yeah, okay, got it. Thank you. Prior learning assessment credit for completing CP programs. Yeah. So if you're talking about programs, say where physicians are, or nurses or teachers are engaged, yes, absolutely. You can certainly, there's a lot of learning that goes on that can be assessed and can be granted credit. I mean, I think that's a great opportunity, for working backwards. I think that's a great idea. We're being encouraged to become globally minded and incorporate innovative instruction. What changes are you seeing in the field that are affecting the learning space or use of technology? Right now you can, I mean, I think it's a great question. There's a lot to think about here in terms of innovative instruction. I mean, something I know this seems old to many of you, but something that is considered innovative in the professions is what we consider learner-centered instruction. Now, we know as adult educators how important that is. Where you start with the learner, you use good instructional design. For us, this is not innovative, but if you're working in the professions who don't, that are not familiar with this can seem like a revelation. So I would urge you not to forget about the things that we know and that we're really good at as adult educators. So I just want to put a marker there and remind you of that. But I think certainly the learning spaces that are technologically enabled with online instruction, for example, the new accreditation guidelines in medicine have finally taken account of how to give credit and how to value online instruction. So I think many of us, I know, are involved in this, and that's certainly, while it may seem kind of not new for us and innovative, bringing these changes into the realm of practice is really important, and to make sure people can get access to the continuing professional development. So that's certainly one of the areas that I would mention. What do you think about MOOCs for professional development? I think they're another avenue for learning, and so I think the more opportunities that we can create for people to learn is critical. Now, whether you certify it or not, whether there's some kind of assessment, is a central question, because that's been an issue with MOOCs, is people can engage and learn a lot but whether there can be an assessment that verifies that learning has occurred. So I think, I'm of the opinion, the more opportunities people can have creating this culture of learning in the profession, the better. And it doesn't always need to be fully regulated and necessarily accredited. So I think, the MicroMasters at the MicroMasters at MIT and Georgia Tech. I'm really familiar with Georgia Tech because, of course, I was at UGA, University of Georgia, for many years, and we watched them and wondered how they were doing this. Like they were offering, this virtual master's degree, not from just any institution, but from one of the leading engineering schools in the country. So they were able to do it in a cost-effective way. It's been very effective. They're ramping it up. They're looking at some more degrees. So yeah, I think that I wouldn't necessarily call that a MOOC. I would just call that, alternative delivery of some basic degrees at at an engineering school. But yeah, I think it's great. The major conceptual approaches to CPE today. I think I've mentioned, and if I'm not answering the question, please come back, but I think one of the major conceptual approaches today is realizing that professionals don't work in silos, that most professional practice is done in a collaborative way. And so we have, as I talked about earlier, if you think about the 3 phases of professional development, we are teaching at the pre-licensure level, we're teaching in silos for the most part. And at the induction residency phase, we're also mostly teaching in silos. But when our learners get out into practice, they're practicing collaboratively. So there's been a major, I would say this is probably the biggest change since, certainly my book was written in 88 and Hull's book was written in 80. The notion that we need to prepare people for the world in which they are living, not the world that used to exist. And so there's a lot of effort. I'm on the advisory board for the National Center for Interprofessional Education and Practice. That's been very successful. That's trying to broker a lot of relationships and good practices for interprofessional education. You need to start at the pre-service, pre-licensure level, but really it's more difficult to do that than in continuing education, where people are actually practicing collaboratively and using the opportunities of in practice to learn from each other, and with each other, which is the definition of IPE. So I think that's something that has really only become super prominent, I'd say, in the last 15 years. So that's a major conceptual approach that is maybe different from kind of the solo continuing education that dominated for so long. Thank you for all these questions. These are great. I really appreciate them.
Thank you so much, Ron. This is Leslie Cordy. We really appreciate you being here today, as Maria Whitty said and others have said. You've answered a lot of questions this morning. What do you think, as faculty members, perhaps we can do to develop those skills to help mentor people in terms of professional development?
Yeah. I'm going to go back to something I said. Thanks, Leslie, for the question. Is that, the metaphor of a fish not knowing they're in water is relevant here, because we, as adult educators, have developed in ourselves and in our students and through our research the very things that, the very knowledge and skills and practices that are really desperately needed by the professions, which is, teaching and learning. What is effective teaching and learning? How do we effectively develop curricula, plan programs? How can we connect the learning that professionals are doing to their context of practice? I mean, these are things that are our lifeblood as adult educators and continuing educators. And so I think continuing to do those things, to be aware of what some of the new developments are in the professions and to engage with our students in those partnerships. And what I have found, Leslie, is that when if you go to a school of veterinary medicine and they're trying some things out, but they just don't have the evidence base to know what's effective in terms of, say, online learning, or what's effective in terms of evaluation and assessment. So I think continuing to understand and name those skills and practices that we have are really important. And so I would want to stress those types of things to support to continue to develop our programs in those ways, to support our learners, and importantly, to continue to do research as we have done into effective ways of professional development. So, my passion has always been around connecting education to practice. I mean, I think that's what professional education is about. That's what distinguishes it from the kind of academic parts of the university. And so I think we have a special responsibility, a special gift really to continuing to develop that understanding of not just how do you help people develop knowledge, but how do you help them become effective learners. And the thing that we have talked about for decades is lifelong learning, which is now, if you go to any accreditation body in any profession, one of the skills and that they hope that their graduates develop is the ability to learn over their lifespan. Because we know that you teach medical students 5 years later, like half of what you taught them is not correct. So we need to help develop the skills of lifelong learning and self-directed learning, not just the skills, but the stance and the attitudes towards wanting to always get better. And, that's been our central mission. That's what we do as adult educators. And I think it's now, what I've seen over these decades is we've kind of moved from the margin to the center of the concerns of the professions. The things that we have valued and the skills that we've developed have now been taken on, as we try to build out this third phase of professionals' lifetime. So, I think we're really well positioned to be partners in leadership in the professions. And, that's part of what, that's why I'm so glad that we were able to have this contribution to the compendium. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you so much. There's another question out there, but I think, going back to your idea of it's our job to help instill lifelong learning skills in everyone and be mentors, and we are really at the heart of it as adult educators. How do you feel about then this evidence-based practice and sort of the theory in terms of is that real, or is that just something that is sort of a fad at the moment, or does that really build into research to practice?
That is a great question. We could probably talk about that for the next hour. So when I was at the university, I'm going to tell you a story and try to answer this. So when I was at the University of Georgia, a colleague of mine, Dr. Mark A. Bell, who's a family practice doc, and I got university approval for something called the Institute for Evidence-Based Practice in the Health Professions Education. And he's a national expert on evidence-based medicine, and I took on the evidence-based education half of that equation. And so after we created this, and we had a lot of interest across the university, evidence-based practice is big no matter what field you're in. You're right, can be a buzzword. But I had this interesting reaction when I would say to people, yes, I'm now the co-director of this Institute of Evidence-Based Practice. And the first response I would get from many people was, do you mean my doctor is not using the best evidence to make clinical decisions about me? So, I think, and the answer is, they're probably not in many cases. And so I think that we've got a long way to go to making sure that we're using the best evidence to make clinical decisions, and certainly in healthcare. There's definitely pushback against that for many reasons. But I think that I don't see this going away. I mean, I think it's a kind of level of accountability that professions are increasingly being held to. So I think the notion of evidence-based practice is viable. And it's not like the evidence is making decisions. Like the evidence isn't teaching students in classrooms in schools. People are teaching students in classrooms and schools. But to the extent that the teacher is using the best available evidence to make her decisions or his decisions about how to teach, I think that's a good thing. And so I hate to see it used in negative ways, which it sometimes is, but I don't see any diminution in the notion of evidence-based practice in the professions. I think it's here to stay, and how it gets elaborated, I'm not sure.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay, so am I now working for a military college? And so thank you for asking that question, because I'll bet if I asked everyone on the call, do you know what the Uniformed Services University of Health Sciences is? I suspect very few of you would know, which I didn't know until I was recruited to this position. So the Uniformed Services University of Health Sciences, it was established in 1972 as the military's medical school. So we graduate about a quarter of the physicians for the military health system. The military health system is one of the largest health systems in the world. We have hospitals all over the globe, both in battle, in fighting wars, but also domestically. So we have a very large system. It's a closed system. It's like a Mayo Clinic. It's larger than anything like the Mayo Clinic or the Cleveland Clinic. So we established, there was a medical school established, and there was later in the 90s a graduate school of nursing. We now have a postgraduate dental college. But here's the thing that's really interesting. So the Department of Defense, I'm going to answer your question, but I need to give you this context. And 3 years ago, the Department of Defense gave USU $17 million to develop graduate programs in health professions education, which means that we're giving certificates and master's degrees and PhDs in health professions education. So Anita and I are here because we have done this work in colleges of education our whole careers. I'm sure you all have had lots of, if you're in a graduate program in adult education, you've had a lot of, either you yourself are a health professional or you've had other health professionals as colleagues. But the DOD said, we need to get better. So we believe that if we can prepare our doctors and our nurses and our social workers and our veterinarians, yes, there are veterinarians in the MHS, our allied health professionals, if we can teach them how to provide academic educational leadership, if we can teach them how to be effective teachers and faculty members, if we can teach them how to do curriculum development, we're going to end up with a better, more effective healthcare system. So that's how I got here. That's how Anita got here. So it's kind of the extension of our work in colleges of ed to the military. Now, to your question, are you finding differences? So, you know, I've always had nurses as students and other health professionals as students, but what's different, I've said this to a lot of people, what's different about USU is the sense of mission is palpable, that people come to work every day and they know why they're here. They know that they're here to serve the military health needs, whether they're a physician or a nurse or whatever. And so almost all of our students are in uniform. And so it's a very different environment. And it's really, you almost can think of this as an HRD program in the sense that all of our learners are working for the military health system. So either they are at the medical school here, or as Anita and I have been brought here to help develop the distance learning capacity. Like I'm teaching curriculum development this term. I have students in Hawaii, in England, in Florida, in North Carolina, in Ohio. So they're all over in the military health system, and we hope that this program helps them become better clinicians. But the difference, the big difference is the notion of this kind of sense of mission, because they're serving the needs of the military in, you know, in healthcare. So it's loads of fun, I have to say. It's very different from our graduate programs in colleges of ed, where you have people coming from, which is also great, from very different organizations and types of practice. So that's exciting too. But it's different in that way because everyone's working for the same, you know, for the same company, so to speak. Thank you for that question. I was hoping to be able to kind of provide that background to what we're doing here. Yeah, you know, thank you for your comment, Michelle. I mean, you do feel, I mean, really, you feel like you come to work and you're making, you know, I'll tell this story that we have a surgeon in our program it's in my curriculum development course. And when we recruited him, well, he inquired about our program. He's a surgeon in Iraq. And so he was really interested. He wanted to get better, and he's now stationed at Fort Bragg in North Carolina, developing programs for the residents there. And at the beginning of the course, you know, I talked to all our students, as we tend to do in our adult ed programs. And he said he wanted to let me know that the way things work is that he could get a call saying, your bags are packed tomorrow morning, we're sending you somewhere. And he said, I just want to let you know that you're on my wife's call list, so that if it turns out that I get shipped out, she's going to call you and let you know, don't worry, I'm still being involved in the course. You know, I'm going to do the assignments, but it'd be a little while until I get Wi-Fi access. So, you know, there's that sense of mission, but I also say the students are very grateful, like in curriculum development, many of you teach program planning. They would say, we didn't know we're just usually given a curriculum. We didn't understand that there was a process and a theory and how to do this effectively. So all of the things that we teach in adult education are of great value to our learners here.
There's another question about assessment.
Can you talk about assessment? How do we demonstrate evidence of learning in CPE? Well, you know, we think about, if you're familiar with Kirkpatrick's level of outcomes, from, you know, participation through satisfaction, through learning, through performance, you know, that's been elaborated on by a number of us over time. Certainly the gold standard is, you know, have you gold standard is have you improve the practice of the learner in your CPE program, and even more importantly, have those changes in her practice impacted in a positive way the people she serves, either as learners or patients or clients or whatever. So that ties back to one of my earlier comments about the notion of connecting education and learning with practice. So I really think that that's the best form of assessment. We often have difficulty getting to that level, so certainly assessing whether learning has occurred is critical, that you lined out in the learning objectives. So I think that this is a big topic on assessment, and we're very focused on that here. We teach a course on assessment. It's really important, and certainly in the healthcare field. So thinking about levels of outcomes is probably a good way to know whether you have evidence for impact.
So we've got 2 more questions, and we might want to wrap up.
Okay, 2 more questions. Favorite curriculum and program planning texts? Is that a question? Over the years, I've always used Caffarella. I always found that to be, the students really enjoyed that, kind of that stepwise practical approach. Of course, I use my text on working the planning table. I think these complement each other. And since I got here, there's a textbook in medical education called Curriculum Development in Medical Education. It's a great book. I'm using it this time. It's a 6-step process that starts from needs assessment, goes through evaluation, talks about implementation and sustainability. So that's, if you're teaching in medical education, that's really the gold standard. So I would recommend that in our field. And I guess one more question, we have time.
Yeah.
An environment of evidence-based practice in CPE and with adult ed research often focused on qualitative designs, do you see a credibility gap for adult educators when working with professionals? This is a great question. First of all, you can produce evidence with qualitative research. So let's make that clear. That evidence is not necessarily simply numerical. So it's a little bit more complicated. There's more work that has to go in to do the observations, but a lot of the good evidence, even in medicine, is through observations and audits, and so yes, you can do this both ways. But having said that, I would say it is true that often some of the research that is qualitative in our graduate programs seeks to develop meaning and understand meanings and understand intentions and motivations. So that kind of research is not going to be as valued in an evidence-based environment because it's not necessarily looking at the outcomes of education, whether they be quantitatively demonstrated or qualitatively demonstrated. So I think that's a great question, deserves a lot more conversation and thought. Oh, is that it? Should I wrap up?
Yeah, Leslie was going to say a few words.
Hello, yeah. All right, so Dr. Cervero, if you have any concluding remarks that you'd like to make about this, and if anybody has any follow-on questions, they can put those into the chat area and we'll try to follow up. So we'll let Ron make some concluding remarks, and then I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Alan Knox just to talk about the follow-on webinars.
Great. Well, thanks. I want to, first of all, thank you all for being here today. It's great to be with adult educators and to be part of the conversation. I do want to end with this quote from Cy Hool because it's been really important to me. So he wrote this in 1980, and he was talking about the future expansion of continuing professional education. And, he said, we have to continue to try to get better. And let me quote him, and he says, his view is learning must occur throughout the lifespan and must assume new and more complex forms. And this is what the rest of this quote is really important. He said, the plans to establish basic educational programs for those entering the professions were thought in the first quarter of this century, meaning the 20th century, to be visionary. But they have now been realized at levels far beyond those of the original dreams. And he goes on to say, continuing education will follow the same pattern of growth. What we hardly dare prophesy today will be seen by later generations as efforts to achieve a manifest necessity. And the way we're going to create that manifest necessity is the work that each of us is doing on the ground to help professionals and help professions design continuing professional development systems and activities that make a difference in the practice of professionals as well as the people that they serve. So just keep that thought. It's gonna be a long historical process, but we're gonna be part of the solution to getting there. So thank you very much for your questions.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Knox, we have a posting in the chat session too about the compendium, but we'd like to hear about the webinars.
Dr. Knox, you want to turn on your microphone. His microphone is turned off.
Right.
You can unmute him.
Right, sorry.
There you go. I just unmuted it. I was following the suggestions on through the last hour to make sure people muted their microphone, and I didn't unmute it. First, thank you to everybody who was involved in preparation for and delivering this first of the 4 sessions. And Ron and his questions and comments in response to your questions on through was a great start to that series. And the way in which it's organized is that 2 months from now, the second of these sessions will occur, and then 2 months after that, the same for the third, and finally in November for the 4th of those. The websites for AAACE and for Stylus carry information about this, and there'll be more detailed information posted within the next few weeks, leading into the next 3 that are involved in terms of the author of an individual article from the compendium and the importance of people who are participating in the discussion to have read that article beforehand. And Ron modeled very well right now. He didn't try to explain to us the content of the article that he and Barb put together, but are depending upon the participants to have read that beforehand. And so I'm looking forward, and I hope most of you are as well, to each of those that are involved. And we have a high enough limit on the number of people who can participate and not only ask questions, but as a number of you did, particularly following up and sharing some comments that you have in response to your question. And if Ron's response, or the same thing for the other 3 authors coming up, don't cover all the things that you had in mind when you asked the question, please feel free to make another follow-up comment so that it becomes increasingly a discussion as well. So, Ron, thank you very much for being the lead author in this series of 4, and I'm looking forward to learning more about each of the 3 remaining topics coming up.
All right, thank you so much for joining us today. Again, our thanks to Dr. Cervero, Dr. Martin, Dr. Knox, and of course, Anita and Donna. And look for that link on the AAACE website, the Stylus website, and other websites. And we hope you'll join us and continuing to help build the profession of adult educators. We can't do it without you.
Meeting has concluded.
Thank you all.
Okay. I just realized they've given.
Go ahead and leave the meeting.